Greetings, America. I'm Barbara Jones Clark, Chair of the Archives and History Committee for the Coretta Scott King Book Awards. Let me begin with a heartfelt acknowledgement of the outstanding background research by Doris Gebel, Secretary of the Archives and History Committee. And thanks to Professor Marguerite Worth Penick as she interviews our friend and colleague, Ginny Moore Kruse. Welcome to our ongoing oral history project, a conversational oral history interview with Coretta Scott King Book Awards history maker Ginny Moore Kruse. CSK juror from 1986 to 1990, founder of the CCBC Intellectual Freedom Information Services, Director Emerita, Cooperative Children's Book Center, and Director from 1976 to 2002. Ginny served as chair of the Newbery Committee in 1981, chair of both the Laurel Ingalls Wilder Award and the Jane Addams Children's Book Award in 2003. She's a member of the Wisconsin Intellectual Freedom Leadership Network Steering Committee.
I am Marguerite Penick of the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh and a member of the Coretta Scott King Archives and History Committee. I'm here with Ginny Moore Kruse, retired director of the Cooperative Children's Book Center, University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome, Ginny. The first thing I'd like you to do is just tell us a little bit about you, your life as a librarian, and the history of the CCBC.
Okay, I'll go back a little farther than you asked and say that my first 5 years of formal education were in a one-room school in rural Wisconsin, where I learned to pay attention and work independently. And there was a lot to be gained by that kind of education. And of course, there was a lot that was missing as well. And then fate took me to a state university lab school. So that was a school where education students in the UW system were practicing being teachers. So we had a lot of student teachers as well as the core faculty in the Department of Education there. And that was like going to the moon from the one-room school. And it was an amazing opportunity for lots of reasons. I have always been interested in literature, and I've always been a reader. My mother was the quote unquote librarian for her homemakers club while I was growing up. And there was always a box of books in our house that she had borrowed from the county library for the farm women who were part of her homemakers club. And so I always was able to dig into adult books as well as go to the public library in Oshkosh, Wisconsin for my own level of reading. As time went on, I became interested in how books were created and who was writing and illustrating books with illustrations. I just became very interested in the creative process behind the books I was enjoying. So after I graduated from college, I was a public school teacher, teaching ninth grade. And I was also in charge of assemblies and meetings of the entire student body once a week. So I had to come up with programs and speakers, and sometimes I wrote scripts. It was a big job, and I might have been foolish to have signed a contract saying that was what I was going to do, but I did it. Time passed. I became married. my husband and I moved to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, where after we had a little family to support, we realized that we needed more than one salary, and I needed to look for a job to add to our family budget. And so I was able, I have some good stories about looking for a job and how I was perceived as a married woman looking for a job in those years. But I did get a job as director of a junior high school library in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And one of the things I'll tell about that is that I experienced my first censorship attempt. And it was actually my supervisor who told me I could not order a certain book that I had chosen in my book order that month. And actually, I came up with reviews. I did all the right things without knowing I was doing the right things to support my choice. But it might be interesting to people to know that the book that I was not supposed to have in my library for the junior high school kids was the book The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, now a classic. So after that, my husband got a great grant to do advanced studies, and we moved out to the Boston area, where I had another fabulous opportunity to be in a junior high school. And it was one where our principal wanted the library to be kind of the center of the school and be almost a community center. He wanted me to schedule music groups, live music in the library. He was very supportive of my bringing authors into the library for students to meet and hear. And so that gave me another kind of experience. And it was an excellent one. That was just a great job in Newton Center, Massachusetts. And also, while we were out in the Boston area, I started teaching children's literature at the college level at Simmons College. We returned to Wisconsin, where I applied for and was given the opportunity to become director of a small non-circulating research library in the field of children's literature. And you've guessed it, it was the CCBC, which was scheduled to be closed at that time. It was losing its funding. And so this job was just there for 1 year. And I thought, oh, I could learn so much if I could just be there for 1 year. What a wonderful opportunity that would be, even though the CCBC is going to close. But it really wasn't, because I found ways with Susan Griffith. She'd been very involved with the Jane Addams Children's Book Award over the years, and she's written a book about it. Susan Griffith was working in the CCBC, and she and I brought the CCBC to teachers and librarians throughout Wisconsin. And funding was found for this library. There was a reason for it, and there was a lot of enthusiasm. So I actually was director of that library from 1976 to 2002. Maybe we should just say that the Cooperative Children's Book Center, or CCBC, is a children's literature research library for adults. It's a library of the School of Education at UW-Madison. The CCBC gets a copy of almost every book published for children and young adults. So we've always been able to see just about every book. We know we've never seen all of them in a given year, but we've seen almost all of them in many years.
One of the things that the CCB is so famous for is tracking the lack of diversity in children's books. Did that start when you were a part of the CCBC?
Yes, Katie Horning and I started to do that, but we tried to emphasize positively what we were finding.
I'm KT Horning. I worked as the director of the CCBC for 20 years. The CCBC is important to me. I've worked here my entire career. I actually wandered into the CCBC when I was an undergraduate, and to be honest, I've never left. I can't think of anything better to do than to read and evaluate great children's books.
We had noticed this paucity of diversity in children's books, Katie Horning and I had. In the middle of the 1980s, we decided to talk about it. We hadn't been talking about it. And so we started, because both she and I were active in various ways in our field. And I did book reviews for Wisconsin Public Radio. And I mean, there were just many ways in which we had a big reach in a way. We weren't keeping statistics according to a statistical method. We were just doing old-fashioned counting. I'm saying that with kind of quotes, old-fashioned counting, not doing data gathering. But we thought, well, we're just going to talk about this now when we give speeches and when we have the opportunity. It's something that we know is true. There's very, very little diversity, and it needs to be said. There were many people who knew that. People affected by the lack of diversity certainly knew that. And many writers and artists who couldn't break in knew that. But as white women who were connected in other kinds of ways, we decided that we would make a point of talking about that. And so we did.
Almost every presentation I go to throughout the country, they share the statistics that the CCBC is still tracking. Have you seen any improvement over the years?
Oh, yes. But, I've been retired since 2002. So, I mean, the really thrilling thing is that the journal, The Horn Book, has an article about the CCBC diversity statistics, great charts. And if you look at that issue of the Horn Book, you will see a lot about changes. And the CCBC has been adding to the data gathering my successors there are now doing. And so they're really gathering an astonishing amount of data about the newly published books.
I'd like you to share with us a little bit about how you got involved with the Coretta Scott King Book Award Committee.
Well, I was asked to be a member of the Coretta Scott King Book Award Committee. I was invited by Effie Lee Morris and Henrietta Smith. It was such an honor, and I really was stunned at the opportunity to be with others who were interested in books written by and illustrated by African-American writers and artists.
Do you remember any of the people that you met that you would like to share stories about while you were on the committee?
Of course, there were many. I was a member of the committee for 5 years. And people who won the awards, of course, we met then at the annual ALA conference and at the Coretta Scott King Award breakfast. And sometimes there were publisher receptions and other special events. And so in some instances, I developed relationships with some of those authors and artists that lasted a long time, and they became involved with me and with the CCBC. So in the 1985, Walter Dean Myers was the author who was honored for Motown and Dee Dee, and there was no illustrator award that year. Candy Dawson Boyd, she had an author honor book, but guess who also had an honor book in 1985? Virginia Hamilton, for A Little Love. And the following year, Virginia Hamilton won the Coretta Scott King Award for The People Could Fly. I especially remember that year. Well, I remember a lot of things about all of my 5 years, but Virginia Hamilton was giving her award acceptance speech in a hotel room, one of the big hotel, rooms, ballroom kind of thing. Not at all like the Coretta Scott King Award is now, but it was still happening in a big way. And all of a sudden, the lights went out and everything came to a standstill. And here we all are in a big hotel. And who's in charge and what's going to happen? And no, there wasn't a fire, but someone took a little flashlight to Virginia Hamilton, and she kind of put it up to her face, not really under her chin, but she had it so that we could see her face, and somehow she could see her script. And she said, "This is the way the people used to tell each other stories in the night, in the woods. And that's how I feel right now," she said, or words to that effect. And she went on to accept her award for the book, The People Could Fly. And I think that's a wonderful story. The Dillons won for illustrations that year. And so it was kind of a perfect year. In addition, Jerry Pinkney won an award for a patchwork quilt. It was quite a year for books for the Coretta Scott King Award, I think. I could just go on and talk about people, but I do want to talk a little bit about Ashley Bryan, because in 1987, he got an author honor for his collection of stories, Lion and the Ostrich Chicks. And he also got an illustrator honor for the same book. I have some original art here in my apartment by Ashley Bryan. Other people who kind of came into the wider community in terms of Coretta Scott King knowledge included Mildred Pitts Walter, and her book, Justin and the Best Biscuits in the World, was such a popular choice. In that respect, I mean popular with children, not that others weren't, but this was very child-centered. And I wonder if anyone's reading it today. Pat Cummings was also creating books at that time. One of the books the Coretta Scott King Award Committee honored while I was on was the book CLOUDS. And we began to see a lot more by Pat. We also were seeing books by Mildred Taylor, which is really very exciting. Mufaro's Beautiful Daughters, written by John Steptoe, was published during the time that I was a member of the award committee. Someone who really was thinking outside of the box and whose book I've always just loved, Alexis DeVoe, wrote a book called Enchanted Hair. Now, as years went on, there was more about the hair of African-American children and books about hair. But this is really, I think, the first book that I remember seeing about hair that would come to the attention of African-American children and people interested in the award. We also had we started to have books written by Julius Lester, who up at that point was a well-known scholar and had not really started writing for children. And his book, The Tales of Uncle Remus, The Adventures of Brer Rabbit, caused a lot of discussion because the Uncle Remus stories were very negatively regarded, and rightly so, in my opinion. And so, would it be possible to honor a book that would give us a new Uncle Remus, a classic tale which was not highly regarded at all because of its stereotypes? Would it be possible for Julius Lester's new book about Uncle Remus to be a breakthrough book? And it was. One more thing, Jerry Pinkney was always doing wonderful books. But I do want to mention Walter D. Meyer's novel, Fallen Angels, which was at that time one of the very few books written for young people set in Vietnam, and a very honest story about Vietnam. And yet it was for adolescents, for older children. And that was new at that time. And so that was really groundbreaking and brave, although Walter was always brave.
Your stories are amazing. Would you like to say who mentored you within the Coretta Scott King community?
Who mentored me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Henrietta Smith. Of course.
Of course. Thank you. It's very interesting that you mentioned the challenge banning the outsiders, which of course I taught to my 9th grade English students.
Yeah.
But I also know that you helped start the intellectual freedom part of the cooperative. So I have one more question, which is, if you were to say anything that you've learned over the years since The Outsiders about books being challenged or banned, given our current political climate, what would you say to librarians, and especially new librarians?
Well, at this time, there are so many books being challenged across the country by people who haven't read the books at all, people who don't have library cards, if they're looking at books in a public library and saying that no one should read them. There are all kinds of book bannings that are happening. I think that librarians who have been doing book selection according to reviews, according to the standards they have been set within their communities, I think they are fine. And I mean, I don't know that anyone's fine at this point. I really do have to say, I feel a little bit pessimistic about it now, but the CCBC began in the late 1970s to offer an intellectual freedom service to Wisconsin teachers and librarians if they were having a book censorship attempt. Even back then, they would contact us if they wished, and we would provide reviews and other material related to their challenge, and we would provide that to them at no cost. And it was a confidential information transaction, and so that was something we did every year. And in a way, the CCBC was on call to do that at all times. And I'm told they've never been busier than they are in this particular year. Very, very busy fielding requests for assistance. Even with all the online information that we can all get, that we all have access to now, there's still a need to discuss this with another person, to get a perspective on what's going on locally with someone who does have a wider perspective on it and can sometimes provide additional information. for a local discussion. So I don't know what else to say about intellectual freedom at this time, because I think anything I would say might be inaccurate in another couple of months. It's a big, big challenge for the ALA in general. I've heard the ALA president interviewed on TV about the current book banning, and my heart goes out to everyone who is a librarian or a teacher who is doing the right thing in terms of providing excellent literature for the children and young adults for whom they're responsible.
Thank you so much, Ginny. That was my last question. But have you thought of any more stories you would like to share? Or is there anything else you would like to add to the history and archives of the Coretta Scott King Book Awards?
Well, I'll just say that it was such an honor to be invited to join the book selection committee, as I think it was called at that time. I call it the Book Award Committee. I was just stunned. I was bowled over when I was invited to join it. I had no idea that such an honor would ever come my way. And I took it very, very seriously. I had never been on a committee where all others were African American, and I was welcomed, and I had an outstanding and happy experience. But I did have a sense of, for the first time in my life, my professional life, of how it must feel to be the only one in a group, the only person of color, the only person of, fill in the blanks, a certain kind of diversity in a group. And, all we can be is who we each are. And we can't speak on behalf of our race, or, we don't represent our race, but sometimes, that has happened for people of color. And, I had that experience only in a reverse way myself. As part of this great honor I was given, and the trust I was given to be prepared and serious and honest and ready to discuss books, as well as ready to listen to everyone else and to hear what others on the committee were saying. It was just a wonderful opportunity, and I'm so grateful for it.
On behalf of the Archives and History Committee, I want to thank you again for sharing with us.
Well, thank you.
Thanks are extended to our Archives and History Committee members for their outstanding work. They bring diverse frames of reference to our committee: school, public, university, on the perspective of Book Trade Journal. Yours truly, Barbara Clark, Chair; Crystal Char Jeter, Immediate Past Chair; Doris Gebel, Secretary; and Danielle Ponton, the ALA Liaison for the Office of Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services. Committee members Rita Aubach, Sam Bloom, Laura Simeon, Idella Washington, and Dr. Marguerite Worth Penick.